Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for our risk-based vendor due diligence, identifying the proper scope, scale, and documents webinar. My name is Jessie Redmond, and I will be your host. On your screen, you should see multiple widgets that you can use, including Ask Questions, Media Player, Slides, Related Content, Speaker Bio, Request Demo, and Help. If you are unfamiliar with our webinars, all the widget boxes are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to maximize your screen space. At the bottom of your screen in the toolbar are icon buttons you can use to show and hide those widgets. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner of the widget. If you experience any issues or have technical questions, you can use the Help widget or submit them along with any other questions through the Ask Question widget. Don't worry, we do capture all questions throughout the session. We will answer some during the webcast, but those that we do not have a chance to answer live, we will address with you via email. Today's live session is eligible for 1 CPE credit. If you wish to receive this credit, please remember to be logged in individually with your own credentials, answer all 3 polling questions that appear on your screen during today's presentation, be in attendance for the entire live 1-hour session, and complete the follow-up survey. We will send the link to the follow-up survey 24 hours after the live session. If you meet all requirements, we will send your CPE certificate within 7 to 10 business days following survey submission. With us today, we have Christine Kitamura, VendMinder's Senior Content Manager of Education. She will discuss how to identify the right scope and scale for vendor due diligence, what documents to collect, tips for dealing with missing documentation, and what to do with your vendor due diligence results. You will see a link to a copy of today's slide deck, a link to our website, a link to our samples library, links to our when and how often to perform vendor due diligence infographic, our 7 steps of risk-based vendor due diligence infographic and matrix, our due diligence checklist for low, moderate, and high-risk vendors, as well as a link to our library of additional resources, all within the related content widget. With all that being said, I would like to hand it over to Christine. The floor is now yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me today for our webinar on risk-based vendor due diligence. This is usually one of the most popular discussions in third-party risk management, whether you're a beginner or advanced, because it can be so challenging to figure out which documents to collect from vendors, especially since many of these documents don't have standard names. So I hope today's session will help simplify the due diligence process. And before I begin, I just want to quickly go over today's agenda. I'll start off with an overview of vendor due diligence, then talk a little about some baseline due diligence to collect. I'll review some sample due diligence items for low, moderate, and high-risk vendors, then give some tips on what to do when you can't obtain something from your vendor. You'll also learn about some situations for when you might need to request additional due diligence, and I'll end with some key takeaways. Okay, I'll begin with the very basics of what vendor due diligence is. This is the process in third-party risk management where you'll collect, review, and assess vendor information and controls. As you look at the vendor risk management lifecycle here, you'll notice that due diligence is done during the onboarding stage before you sign a contract with a new vendor, and periodically during the ongoing stage with your existing vendors. This process helps determine the residual or leftover risk of your vendor, and it's one of the most important activities because it basically gives you validation that your vendor relationship is safe. In some ways, it's kind of like doing a background check on your vendor to make sure that your organization is partnering with a legitimate business that won't cause harm to you or your customers. As I mentioned, there are 2 situations when you'll need to perform due diligence. Initial due diligence is done during the onboarding stage and always needs to be completed before you sign the contract. This helps you analyze the vendor's risk that you'll be exposed to during the engagement, and it can also help you determine if the vendor will help meet your strategic and financial goals. For example, if you review your vendor's financial statements and discover a lot of red flags like significant debt or declining revenue, that might be a sign that they aren't going to meet your financial goals. Ongoing due diligence is done on a recurring basis after you sign the contract. A vendor's risk and performance can change, so it's really important to maintain a due diligence practice and continue to validate their information and controls. Ongoing due diligence will be more frequent for critical and high-risk vendors, but this should still be a regular practice for all of your vendors. Now I want to talk about some specific reasons why you need to do vendor due diligence. Understanding these reasons can be really helpful if you're ever dealing with some resistance, either internally or from your vendors who maybe don't want to spend time completing this process. The first reason that can really drive action is knowing that it's a regulatory expectation. And I want to point out that these expectations align with the due diligence principles I mentioned earlier, meaning that this process should occur before you sign the contract, it should be risk-based, and it should be ongoing. So the interagency guidance mentions that due diligence should be conducted before third-party selection, and the NCUA's guidance says that it should be tailored to the complexity of the relationship. And the OSFI in Canada also has guidance that states financial institutions should perform due diligence on an ongoing basis. The second reason for due diligence is pretty straightforward. It just makes good business sense, and it can help validate that your organization is partnering with high-quality vendors. The information you review during due diligence can confirm that controls are in place to protect your organization's data, reputation, and operational resilience. It also helps you complete a vendor risk review, which collects all of this information into a single source. And this is a tool you can use to compare two or more vendors that might offer a similar product or service, but one vendor has stronger controls in place. And due diligence will also help you make better decisions about your vendor relationships, like rejecting a new vendor during onboarding or justifying your decision to exit the relationship. The last reason I want to cover is that due diligence can help prevent larger issues. When you collect and review this information and documents, you'll have better insight into the vendor's control environment, which may have some concerns that you want to address before you sign or renew the contract. The due diligence process allows you to identify any gaps or weaknesses, such as the vendor's untested business continuity plan. So when these gaps are identified early, you can require remediation through contract provisions. And in general, due diligence helps you understand which areas of the vendor relationship will need more oversight. If a vendor has significant gaps in their security controls, you'll know that this is something that needs to be monitored and tracked more closely. Now we can review some of the documents to collect during due diligence. But I really want to emphasize that this isn't a comprehensive list because every organization is going to have unique requirements. A healthcare organization is going to collect different types of documents than a credit union or bank. So just keep that in mind as you're looking at these lists. The first category is baseline documents. So these are the things you'll want to consider collecting from every vendor, regardless of the inherent risk or criticality. And the main purpose of baseline due diligence is to verify that the vendor is legitimate and that they have a good or at least a decent reputation. So things like their basic information, a business license, OFAC or PEP check, credit report, and any negative news you may have found on the vendor, like poor business practices or financial issues. Mutual non-disclosure agreements might also be a baseline document if you're sharing confidential information, and any specialized certifications or licenses that apply to that vendor's industry. Once you've established those baseline documents, you can start thinking more strategically about risk-based due diligence, which means that the higher the risk, the more due diligence you'll need to collect. For your low-risk, non-critical vendors, you'll generally be okay just collecting those baseline documents. And these are the vendors that are not essential for your daily operations and do not interact with your customers or have any access to sensitive information. But for moderate risk vendors, you'll need to start collecting more information in addition to that baseline due diligence. And this could include things like 3 years of their audited financials, insurance certificates, and maybe their third-party risk management practices, so you can evaluate how they're handling your fourth parties. You can also collect things like internal and external audit reports and any relevant policies, such as anti-money laundering, information security, and data retention and destruction. For critical and high-risk vendors, these are the third parties that will need to submit the most information and documents because these can have the biggest impact on your organization. So just as a starting point for your critical and high-risk vendors, You should be collecting all of those baseline documents plus everything that you collected from your moderate risk vendors. And from there, you would want to collect additional information like the items listed here. You should be requesting things like their policies and procedures and information about senior management and the owners of their organization. Business continuity and disaster recovery plans are also really important to collect because if your critical vendor is unprepared for something like a natural disaster, that means that your organization might not be able to function as normal. Penetration and vulnerability testing results are also important to review, along with a record of any outages, and you may also want to consider a site visit for these types of vendors. So far, I've been talking mostly about risk-based due diligence, but it's also important to consider document collection that's specific to the product or service that the vendor is providing. And here are some examples of what that might look like. If a vendor is storing or processing credit card information, that would require confirmation that they're PCI compliant. If they're performing collection services, you would need to make sure that they have the required licenses and certifications, which are usually different depending on the jurisdiction. And if they're storing, processing, or transmitting PHI, you should be collecting documentation to verify that they're compliant with HIPAA. And these are all good examples of why any standardized list of due diligence should still be evaluated for each vendor engagement, just to make sure you're not missing any required information. And before we move on to the next section, it's time for our first poll question of the session.
And this brings us to the first poll question of the day. You should see the poll question now in the slides area. If you have any issues, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we will be happy to assist. Just another reminder, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. This poll question is, which of the following best describes your process for due diligence document collection? We request the same documents from every vendor. Documents are requested based on the product or service. We use standard document lists based on inherent risk and criticality. We don't have a formal process, other, or not sure. Christine, we have some time now to answer a question from the audience.
Great.
And that question is it recommended to create a master list of due diligence documents that we can give to every vendor?
This is a common question, and I can understand the appeal of creating a master list. However, I would not recommend doing this because due diligence is really most effective and efficient when it's risk-based. So if you think about the variety and complexity of each of your vendor relationships, there just isn't really a simple way to create a master list that would address all of those different risks. And even if you did create this comprehensive list of due diligence, you'll end up asking many of your vendors for information that doesn't even apply to their product or service. So just to give an example, let's say you created a master list that included things like SOC reports and evidence of all these different types of security testing. Those types of documents wouldn't be relevant for a low-risk, non-critical vendor that doesn't have access to any of your data. And that just turns into extra time communicating with the vendor who's questioning why you're asking for these items. And some of your vendors might not even have those documents to begin with. So a better approach is to think of risks that you need to address with each vendor and base your due diligence requests on that. So instead of a master list, you may want to create a list of baseline due diligence first with documents that verify the vendor is a legitimate business and that they have a good reputation. And from there, you can build upon that baseline with standardized lists of documents for different types of inherent risks, like compliance, business continuity, information security, et cetera. And choosing which documents to request would just depend on the risks that you identified on that inherent risk assessment. But always keep in mind that any list you create should still be used only as a starting point because each vendor relationship needs to be assessed individually. And you don't want to risk missing something during due diligence just because it wasn't on your list of items to review.
Thanks everyone for answering that poll question. Here are the results. By the way, you may have noticed reactions such as a thumbs up or heart coming across the screen. If you find this feature distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner of the Slides widget, which will expand the slides to full screen and no longer show the reactions. Before moving on, in the Related Content widget, you can find when and how often to perform vendor due diligence infographic. This resource walks you through vendor due diligence that needs to be done before signing the contract, as well as due diligence to collect as part of the risk reassessment. Back to you, Christine.
Now that I've covered some of those common due diligence documents, I want to focus more on what the actual process looks like. And to understand due diligence, you also need to understand that it's part of a broader activity known as a vendor risk assessment. So here are some key terms that are important to know, starting with inherent risk. This is the risk that's natural within the vendor relationship before you apply any controls. If a vendor is storing your customer's sensitive data, that would be an inherent risk that you need to identify without considering what types of practices the vendor has to protect that data. Residual risk is what's left over after internal and external controls are applied, and ratings are always a calculated result of different factors. In vendor risk assessments, you'll typically see an inherent risk rating and an overall vendor risk rating, which does consider those controls. And controls are those methods or processes that are intended to reduce risk. These can either be applied internally by your organization or externally by the vendor. And the equation listed here is an easy to remember formula of how you determine the residual risk. You'll take that inherent risk assessment, apply those validated controls, and the result is the residual risk, which will never be higher than the inherent risk. Here are some different types of inherent risk, and I want to point out that many of these are actually listed in both the interagency guidance and the NCUA guidance. So it's good to know that these are common risks that regulators are focusing on. These questions are examples of what you might use on an inherent risk assessment to determine whether a vendor is exposing you to a certain risk. You'll notice that these aren't questions you're asking the vendor, they're questions to be asked internally within your organization. For reputation risk, you might ask if the product or service impacts your clients or customers. And you could also ask if the vendor is directly interacting with them. And I want to highlight financial risk because that one is really custom for every organization. I'll use this as an example later when I talk about due diligence based on inherent risk. But I want to emphasize that the question asking about an expense over $50,000 within a single year might look different for your organization. For a smaller organization, a significant vendor cost might be only half that amount, while a larger organization would only consider it significant if it was double that amount. So this really is the only example here that isn't going to apply to every organization. And going down to cybersecurity risk, you might ask if the vendor's service requires integration with your network or if they simply have access to your network. It's recommended to use yes or no questions at this stage just to avoid any disputes or ambiguous answers that could result if you have open-ended questions. Here's an example of what you would want to collect from a vendor, starting with that baseline due diligence of basic information, tax ID, liability insurance, and maybe some references. But let's say that this vendor is critical and has elevated risk. That means you'll want to review things like a completed questionnaire or statements from the vendor so you can better understand the vendor's risk and control environment. But that's still not enough. You also need to validate those responses. A vendor could complete a questionnaire that states they're doing all of these practices and they have procedures in place to protect their system, but it's really important to ask for evidence to make sure that the questionnaire is accurate. And this doesn't mean that vendors are intentionally untruthful or misleading. There's just always the possibility that some of the information on that questionnaire is outdated or answered incorrectly by accident. So collecting that evidence will ensure that their practices align with what they say they're doing. And some of that evidence might include internal policies and procedures, audited financial statements, and testing results. But you'll want to avoid accepting just a table of contents as evidence because that's not going to give you the full picture. Due diligence can be really complex because of the amount of information that you need to review and all the different stakeholders involved, but the process itself can basically be broken down into these 3 tasks. It involves validating the legitimacy and good standing of the vendor through gathering that information like negative news, reports from different agencies, and doing an OFAC or PEP check. The second task is reviewing all of that information that you collect on your own and the documents you receive directly from the vendor, like those questionnaires, SOC reports, and security testing results. And the last task is determining the residual risk and deciding whether it's acceptable for your organization to partner with that vendor. I briefly mentioned these 2 methods of due diligence, but I really want to help you understand the difference between the 2 and the benefits and disadvantages of each one. Starting with due diligence based on risk rating, this is the method where you're looking at the risk level and criticality, either low, moderate, or high, and critical or non-critical. Due diligence on a high-risk and/or critical vendor is going to be more frequent, and the scope will be wider, meaning that you'll collect a lot more information in addition to those baseline documents. Due diligence based on inherent risk means that you're looking at the types of inherent risk to determine which controls need to be verified. So a vendor with cybersecurity risk will need to have their security controls evaluated through due diligence, where you're looking at things like procedures and testing results. And a vendor with compliance risk will need to be evaluated in that area to make sure that they're compliant with relevant laws and regulations. Both methods have their pros and cons, so it can actually be more efficient to build a strategy where you're looking at the risk rating and the inherent risk to perform due diligence. Some of the benefits of the risk rating method is that it simplifies the outreach process to the vendor. You'll know exactly what to collect from all your low, moderate, and high-risk vendors without considering the types of risk. And this method is also more manageable for smaller teams or for stakeholders who don't have a lot of experience with third-party risk management. However, this method can sometimes mean that you're collecting too much or too little due diligence if you're setting the same document standards for every vendor within that risk rating. Vendors might even push back if you're asking for things that aren't relevant to their product or service. And some of the controls might not be validated if the overall rating is low or moderate. On the other hand, the inherent risk method helps build higher quality vendor risk assessments that are tailored to the individual engagement. There's less pushback from the vendors because you're asking for relevant documents, and it just creates a much smoother process. But this method can also be more challenging to implement, and it's not as consistent as due diligence based on risk rating because you're looking at each vendor relationship on its own. And setting up this method will require more time and resources, which may not be available to smaller teams. Next, I'll show you what each method looks like, starting with due diligence based on risk rating. There are 6 categories here, and remember that it's important for vendors to have both a risk rating and a criticality classification. Vendors that are classified as critical will still require the highest frequency of due diligence, regardless of the risk rating. For all critical and high-risk vendors, due diligence should be done at least annually. And this includes doing that baseline vendor vetting and maybe having an ongoing risk monitoring service. You should also be assessing their business continuity and disaster recovery plans and doing a financial review. Some organizations might also require on-site assessments, and a standard due diligence request of their documentation should be done once a year. For non-critical vendors that are low risk or moderate, the due diligence frequency can be around 3 years or 2 years, and generally this might only include vendor vetting and a reputation and credentials check. And before I move on to the next method, we're going to do our second poll question.
Our second poll question of the day is, what is your biggest challenge when performing due diligence? Receiving incorrect documents from vendors, vendors are unresponsive to document requests, not enough resources to review vendor documents, keeping up with ongoing due diligence, other or not sure. Christine, we have some more time to answer a question from the audience.
Great.
And that question is, do you have any suggestions on due diligence for vendors that use AI?
Sure, this is another question that's becoming more common, and it seems like, nearly every technology vendor is using AI in some capacity. So it is really important to make sure that they're using AI responsibly and mitigating any risks that are involved. So some of the information you'll need to collect from the vendor will depend on how they're using AI, but there are some general items to consider, like documentation on legal and regulatory compliance, and even policies that describe the vendor's commitment to ethical AI practices, which could address things like bias and transparency and fairness. It could also be helpful to request things like independent audits of the AI model outputs and information on their training data, which is the data that's being used to teach the machine learning model. Another thing I've seen organizations request is documentation on explicability, which basically describes the process and method of how an AI model reaches an outcome. And in addition to these types of information, it's important to address other areas like data retention and privacy, security testing, and evidence that the vendor has implemented security controls within their AI system. And I'm sure there is going to be other types of due diligence to consider, especially as AI risk continues to grow and change. But this should give you a good baseline to start out with.
Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to address the poll. Before continuing, I would like to direct your attention to our 7 steps of risk-based vendor due diligence infographic and matrix in the related content widget. Be sure to check out this resource that contains an informative infographic and matrix visual guide. Christine, back to you.
For this next method, I'll spend some more time here because there's a lot more variables to consider when you're doing due diligence based on inherent risk. And before I begin, I just want to explain how these slides are organized. On the left side, you'll see mitigating control areas. This is basically a list of categories that the vendor should have controls in to mitigate or lower its risk. The right side lists several due diligence items that you would collect to review those mitigating control areas. The first inherent risk is a vendor that hosts or stores sensitive information. When you think about this type of vendor, your first thought is probably cybersecurity control. And yes, that's definitely an important control area, but you should also be evaluating other areas like the vendor's human resources, privacy, compliance, and even their vendor risk management practices. If this vendor is storing your sensitive information, it's important to verify certain practices, like making sure they have proof of regulatory compliance. You would also need to make sure that you have a list of any of their third parties who may have access to your data and confirm that your vendor is managing that risk properly. This next inherent risk is slightly different. Rather than a vendor that is storing your sensitive information, this one only has access to it, maybe because their system integrates with yours or the vendor needs to log into your system to perform a certain function. For this type of risk, some of the control areas are similar, but others might not be relevant to the vendor's service. For example, any controls they have for system and network security won't really have the ability to protect your sensitive information because the vendor isn't storing it within their system. So while vulnerability and penetration testing would be something to review for a vendor that stores your information, that's not really going to be relevant for a vendor that only has access to it. This next inherent risk is a vendor that is directly interacting with your customers or clients. Some of those mitigating control areas would be an analysis of their reputation to make sure that the vendor doesn't have significant customer complaints or negative news. Human resources with background investigations, training, and performance monitoring are other areas that the vendor should have controls in. And compliance and vendor risk management would also be important control areas. If a vendor is non-compliant in some way or they have poor vendor risk management practices, that could have a negative impact on how they're interacting with your customers and reflect poorly on your organization. Some of the due diligence to collect would be applicable certifications and proof of regulatory compliance and policies and procedures. Now, what about business continuity risk and vendors that are critical to your operations? This could be your cloud service provider or really any vendor that you rely on for your daily operations. Some of those mitigating control areas would be internal communication and approvals by the appropriate authority. You really don't want these types of vendors to be performing their processes without any approvals or communicating in a really disorganized or inconsistent way. These vendors should also have controls around service level agreements and active monitoring to make sure they can identify any issues around service quality or delivery. Other mitigating control areas would include business continuity and disaster recovery, so the vendor is prepared to recover from incidents and resume operations within a reasonable time frame. Some of the due diligence items to collect would be the vendor's business continuity and disaster recovery planning and testing, proof of regulatory compliance, and a list of critical vendors. And this is especially important because your critical vendor should understand their own vendor inventory and which of their third parties are critical to their operations. So financial risk is one that's sometimes overlooked in comparison with the others, but it's important to consider the inherent risk that comes from a significant cost that's associated with the vendor. This could be the cost of implementing or maintaining their product or service, or even the cost of switching to an alternate vendor. Those mitigating control areas would, again, be that internal communication and approvals, SLAs and monitoring, and the financial health of the vendor. If there's a significant cost with the vendor and that vendor files for bankruptcy 6 months after you onboard them, that would be a significant risk that you need to consider. And as far as due diligence, it's important to collect things like proof of regulatory compliance, relevant policies and procedures, and financial documents so you can review their financial health. Okay, last inherent risk I'll cover is a vendor that has unescorted physical access to your facilities. This could be a wide variety of vendors that provide anything from inspection and repair services or even janitorial workers that are cleaning your facilities after hours. For these types of vendors, those control areas would include internal communication, SLAs and monitoring, human resources, privacy, and compliance. Due diligence items to collect would be a list of the vendor's employees that will have access to your facilities and evidence that they're performing background screenings on their employees. You might also want to ask for evidence of privacy and compliance training that's done either internally or externally, and all associated policies and procedures. On these next 4 slides, I'm going to walk you through a sample risk review. This is for a fictional vendor called PayPro Experts that provides payroll services. And I chose this type of vendor because I'm sure most of you have a payroll provider in your organization, so I hope this sample risk review can help clarify this process. Starting with the criticality determination, these are the 3 questions that are commonly used. Answering yes to at least one of those questions usually means you're dealing with a critical vendor. And for this example, PayPro Experts is considered critical because it would cause a significant disruption if you suddenly lost this vendor or if there was an outage that required longer than 24 hours to restore. This vendor is also considered high risk because of these different types of inherent risks that are associated with the service. It could expose you to high operational risk because it impacts your ability to pay employees, and compliance risk because of various federal and state regulations that are related to payroll. Information security risk would be another type because this vendor is storing sensitive employee information, like their social security numbers, addresses, and maybe bank information if employees have direct deposit set up. And you would even need to think of reputation risk because this vendor is interacting with your employees, and poor service or a failure can damage your reputation. In some cases, that could impact your ability to find or retain talent if you have this reputation of not being able to pay your employees consistently. First, I'm going to look at operational and compliance risk. And underneath each of those risk types are those mitigating control areas. And remember that these are the areas that the vendor should have controls in, which should mitigate that risk. For operational risk, you're looking at those control areas of internal communication, established SLAs and active monitoring, and business continuity and disaster recovery. For compliance risk, you're looking at areas in human resources like background investigations and training, compliance areas like audit and assurance, risk management activities, and the vendor's own vendor risk management practices, which is how the vendor is managing its own third parties. And the due diligence items you'd collect for these inherent risks would be things like business continuity and disaster recovery plans and testing, applicable certifications, and policies and procedures. A SOC 2 Type 2 report might be collected if the vendor didn't provide business continuity and disaster recovery information. And you would also want to get a list of their critical vendors along with an assessment of their vendor risk management practices. For those last two inherent risks, let's look at the mitigating control areas of information security and reputation. Those control areas for information security would be cloud and cybersecurity controls and physical security, because this vendor is storing your sensitive information, so they should have some safeguard in place to prevent anyone from having access to their facilities. The vendor should also have controls in place for their system and network security, access and asset management, encryption practices, and threat and vulnerability management. Control areas for reputation risk would be an analysis of that vendor's reputation. If this payroll vendor had a poor reputation of constant outages or data breaches, that's going to negatively impact your own reputation among your employees. The vendor should also have controls within their human resources. And I just want to point out that some of these mitigating control areas are overlapping with other risk types. I mentioned human resources for compliance risk, and here it is again under reputation. So you're basically mapping these control areas to different risk types. Many of the due diligence items are also similar, like proof of regulatory compliance and associated policies and procedures. Vulnerability and penetration testing and privacy policies are also important to collect. And privacy policy is actually listed there twice because it could fall under the control area of information security and reputation risk. The final part of a vendor risk review is obtaining a review from a subject matter expert. These experts can either be internal or external to your organization, but what's most important is that they're qualified in their risk domain. So when you're reviewing all these different types of documents, this step will usually involve multiple experts. The expert's first task is to evaluate that vendor documentation. So someone who's an expert in financials, like a CPA, would review the vendor's financial statements, while someone who's an expert in information security would review the vendor's cybersecurity documents. And the next task is for that expert to provide a documented opinion on whether the vendor's risk management practices and controls are sufficient. For example, that information security expert might review the vendor's penetration testing results and discover that the vendor hasn't addressed an issue that was found during testing. That might cause the expert to form an opinion and state that the vendor's controls in this area are not good enough. And the final task is for that expert to make a recommendation based on his review. That could look like the expert suggesting for the organization to implement controls like more frequent monitoring, or they could suggest that the organization reject the vendor and decline the relationship. The example shown here is that PayPro expert hasn't tested its business continuity plan in over 3 years. Your expert documents their opinion that this control area is insufficient and makes a recommendation that your organization requires current testing results before you sign or renew the contract. Aside from figuring out which documents to collect during due diligence, one of the biggest challenges is not getting something from the vendor, either because they're unwilling or unresponsive, or because they don't actually have the document you're asking for. Oftentimes things like SOC reports aren't available because the vendor is new and hasn't been operating long enough to obtain one, or because the vendor just chooses not to have one since they can be a large expense and they're not mandatory. And another common reason is that the vendor just doesn't want to share something like a business continuity plan that has sensitive information in it. So when situations like this happen, the first step is to document it and explain why the vendor isn't providing something. You should also determine if you can accept an alternate document. Sometimes the vendor might say that they can't provide something and offer an alternate, or you can even suggest a different document that's acceptable. Some vendors are willing to provide a heavily redacted document, so you could try asking for that, or ask the vendor to share the document during a video call so it's not actually in your possession. Another option is to review the document in person if you can do an on-site visit, or maybe schedule a call with a subject matter expert to review the controls verbally. You might ask the vendor for a written attestation of suitable controls, and if necessary, seek a formal risk acceptance from your senior management. Just make sure you're providing senior management your documented attempts at obtaining the item from the vendor. As you're going through this process of trying to obtain missing due diligence, one thing to consider is to make sure there's a binding NDA before you ask them for any sensitive information. This can just help give that reassurance that your organization isn't going to share any of their data. Also, ask the vendor to document their reasons for not sharing certain information. It's important to ask yourself whether their reasons make sense. If they say they don't have a stock report yet, or they don't want to share sensitive data, that might be a more valid reason than saying something vague like, that's not our policy or our business practice. The vendor might even claim that their other customers don't require them to submit due diligence, which may be true for some of their customers, but I would still consider that a red flag for not being willing to share information about their practices. And if you're comparing 2 or more vendors and only one of them is refusing to comply with your due diligence request, that could be another red flag. Sometimes you'll just need to communicate with the vendor to make sure that they really understand the purpose and value of due diligence. But if they understand that and still are not willing to cooperate, that could be a sign that they're hiding something like poor security practices that they don't want your organization to see. And our last poll question is related to this issue of missing due diligence.
Our third and final poll question is, how do you typically handle a vendor that doesn't provide a document during pre-contract due diligence? Request a redacted or alternative document, suggest a video call to review the document virtually, seek formal risk acceptance from senior management, choose an alternate vendor, other or not sure. Christine, let's go ahead and answer another question that's coming from the audience.
Sure.
Great, and that question is, what are some tips for organizing each vendor's due diligence documents?
I think this is good to think about because I'm sure many of us are familiar with the large volume of documents that are involved in due diligence. So it really is worth your time and effort to figure out a strategy for storing them in a way that works well for your organization. So ideally, you'll want to store your due diligence documents in a central repository that's easily accessible to all stakeholders. There's a lot of solutions out there that can be effective, but I do want to recommend being mindful of a couple of details. And first is the naming structure or naming convention, because it's going to be really difficult to keep track of hundreds or thousands of documents if all of these files are not named consistently. I've seen some organizations use a very simple structure of the vendor name plus the description of the document and a date or date range, and maybe even a version. But of course, you can use whatever naming convention that might be standard at your organization. And some document storage solutions also give you the option of using tags, which can be helpful if you want to organize your documents by maybe the source or vendor owner. But I would still recommend being consistent with the actual naming of the document so anyone can easily find what they're looking for. And the second detail is to make sure that you have a system or process in place of tracking important dates, like expiration or renewal dates, because some documents like stock reports and insurance certificates can expire in between your periodic due diligence reviews. So it's really important to make sure that you have some type of reminder in place to request those documents when they're no longer valid.
And here are those results. Thank you everyone for answering this question. I'd like to quickly mention that in the related content widget, you can find our due diligence checklist for low, moderate, and high-risk vendors. This is a handy resource you'll want to grab. Let's continue with the presentation. Back to you, Christine.
As I start to wrap up, I want to review a few situations when you'll need to request additional due diligence after you sign a contract. It's important to remember that due diligence should always be an ongoing practice, and you may have new requirements throughout the contract term. The first situation would be the purchase of a new product or service. Going back to that payroll example, maybe you decide to purchase a new employee training program or consulting service from that same vendor. These two services are different from payroll and would therefore require different due diligence. So you're not replacing the due diligence you obtain for the payroll service, you're just adding on to it. A decline in performance would be another situation to request due diligence. A vendor's poor financial health could be the cause of the performance issues because they had to lay off staff, but the only way to really investigate it is to review additional due diligence, like their financial records or internal processes. And these are items you already reviewed during onboarding, but you would need to review them again after you sign the contract. Security incidents are another common reason for additional due diligence because you'll want to make sure that they've addressed any vulnerabilities within their system. If the vendor notifies you of an incident, you would probably need to make sure that the vendor patched the issue and performed another round of security testing. And of course, any regulatory updates should initiate additional due diligence. If you think about all the different state privacy laws that are coming out, you shouldn't be waiting until the next round of scheduled due diligence before checking in with your vendor and making sure they're compliant. Before we end today's session, I'll leave you with some key takeaways, starting with the reminder that due diligence is performed before and after you sign the contract. It's not just a one-time activity. Some of the reasons why due diligence is important is that it's a regulatory expectation. It makes good business sense, like allowing you to compare vendors, and it helps prevent larger issues by identifying any gaps or weaknesses in a vendor's controls. Baseline due diligence is that activity you'll do on all of your vendors, regardless of risk level and criticality. This involves making sure that the vendor has a good reputation, is compliant with regulations, and can perform the service that your organization and lines of business need. You might need to request additional documents that are specific to the product or service, like confirming that the vendor is compliant with HIPAA if they store or process PHI. And for some final takeaways, the risk assessment and due diligence process involves that formula of inherent risk plus validated controls, which gives you the residual risk. And that residual risk is always going to be equal to or less than the inherent risk. Due diligence can either be based on risk ratings or inherent risk, but it can be really effective to incorporate both methods into your process. Due diligence that's just based on risk ratings can be good for smaller teams, but just keep in mind that you may end up asking for too much or too little because you're not really accounting for the individual vendor engagement. Mitigating control areas should be identified in the vendor's environment so you can determine which due diligence items to collect. And think about a strategy you'll use when you can't obtain a due diligence item, whether that's asking for an alternate or suggesting a review over a video call, or maybe seeking risk acceptance from senior management. And finally, additional due diligence will usually be required if you're purchasing a new product or service from an existing vendor, or if that vendor has a decline in their performance or a recent security incident. And regulatory updates should also initiate additional due diligence. There's still a lot to be said about due diligence because it's such a complex activity in third-party risk management, but I hope today's session gives you a good foundation to work from, and you'll be able to improve some of your current processes with what you learned today. Thank you for joining me, and I hope you enjoyed today's session on due diligence.
Great, thanks so much, Christine. Before we dive into more questions and answers, I would like to thank everyone for attending. I would also like to thank Christine for her time in sharing some important information. On your screen now, you will see our upcoming webinars. On September 5th, our Who Should Be Involved in Third-Party Risk Management webinar, and on September 17th, our The Difference Between Inherent and Residual Vendor Risk webinar. We hope you'll be able to join us for those sessions. A link to register for those is in your copy of today's presentation slides. Let's now go ahead and answer some more questions that have come in during this session. Okay, Christine, our next question is, how often would you do recurring assessments for critical and high-risk vendors?
Well, we recommend the same cadence for reassessments and due diligence. So that would be at least annually for critical and high-risk vendors. However, you may need to do additional assessments if there's a new regulatory update that affects the vendor, or if you were to purchase a new product or service, because those are situations that can affect or change the vendor's risk, which needs to be reassessed and documented. But annually is a good standard to use for these vendors.
Great. Next question. What do you do with the vendors that are too big and don't respond to the due diligence request? Example, a healthcare company.
Yeah, this can be a common challenge. So the first tip I always give is to just look online using terms like company name plus a SOC report or company name plus privacy policy. You might find some good information that way, or at least learn about the process from someone else who is able to find what you're looking for. Or if you have a sales rep for this vendor, you can try reaching out to them to see if they can provide any due diligence documents that aren't available online. I've also seen some people have success with downloading certain reports and documents from online portals on the vendor's website. So that's another option you can try. And you probably won't be able to get everything you want from these large vendors, but always remember to document your efforts, because this is something that regulators and auditors will expect to see. And if necessary, you might just need to obtain that formal risk acceptance from senior management, but make sure that you're showing them your documented efforts so they can make a decision based on that, if that helps.
Great. Next question here. How do we make sure that our vendors are also doing due diligence on their vendors?
This is a great question, because this actually brings up the topic of fourth-party risk management, which is all about making sure that your third parties have oversight on their own vendors. And fourth parties are those vendors that you don't have a direct contract with. So it's important to understand that your oversight is going to be limited, and you'll need to rely on your direct vendors to manage that risk. And we've actually done entire webinars dedicated to this topic, but since this is asking about due diligence, I'll just focus on that area. So making sure that your vendors are doing due diligence on their third parties, it really comes down to obtaining evidence of their practices and setting the right expectations in your contract. So as you're doing due diligence on your direct vendors, that's when you'll need to ask for information like their vendor risk management policy and evidence that they're performing due diligence on their third parties. In some cases, you might want to try asking for the fourth party's due diligence documents, but it's unlikely that you'll be able to collect these since you don't have that direct contract with them. You could also ask for something like a third-party audit on your vendor's third-party risk management program, so you'll at least have that assurance from another source that they're performing due diligence. And it's also important to set those expectations in your vendor contract and require them to perform due diligence to your organization's standards. So for example, if your organization is following that cadence of annual due diligence for critical and high-risk vendors, that would be an appropriate expectation to have for your direct vendors to perform on their own third parties.
Great. We still have time for a few more questions. And the next one is, should we be updating our due diligence document list regularly?
I do think it's a good idea to evaluate any due diligence lists you have at least annually, just to confirm that you're still requesting relevant information from your vendors. But a lot of those baseline documents probably won't change too much over time because things like basic information and tax IDs are pretty standard things to collect from every vendor. But I would recommend looking at your standardized lists that are based on risk level or inherent risk, because some of those items might need to be updated. Just to use an example, you might have a standardized list of documents for compliance risks that includes policies for state privacy laws. But by this time next year, there could be a federal regulation on privacy that replaces all of those different state privacy laws. So in that case, you would need to update your due diligence list to request evidence that your vendor is compliant with this new federal regulation. So you might not need to do a full update every year, but you should at least be evaluating your list with the help of any relevant subject matter experts who can let you know if any of those documents are no longer relevant and maybe need to be updated with a different item.
Great. Next question. What documents should we collect from foreign vendors?
We get a lot of questions about foreign vendors, and the good news is that due diligence will usually look pretty similar for vendors that are outside of your country. So when you have that risk-based due diligence process, that helps make sure that you're collecting relevant documentation regardless of whether this is a foreign vendor. So that would include basic things like an OFAC or a PEP check, a review of the vendor's hiring processes, and also requesting a list of locations that the vendor uses to support the product or service that you're using. And these locations are especially important for vendors that are storing or transmitting sensitive information, because you'll need to be aware of any compliance issues with relevant privacy laws that can be different based on the location. And aside from privacy laws, it's always a good idea to just confirm that the vendor is compliant with general laws and regulations within their own country. There's also documents you can collect that are related to international standards. So things like the ISO has standards related to information security. So you could consider asking your vendor if they have any reports or evidence that they follow these standards.
Great. Thanks so much, Christine. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for questions today. Thanks again, Christine, for taking the time to address some of those that came in. Any questions we did not have time to answer today, we will address with you offline. We would like to thank you all for attending and hope you found today's session valuable. Another big thank you to Christine for her time and sharing some great content. You can ask even more questions inside of our third-party think tank, an online community that is dedicated to third-party risk professionals and also free to join. Just because today's session has ended doesn't mean the conversations and questions must. Post your questions at thirdpartythinktank.com and see what your peers have to say. In that community, you can find thousands of free educational resources, including ones related to vendor due diligence. If you would like to become a member of Third Party Think Tank, you can register on the site or just shoot us an email and we'll get you registered and send you a link to set your password. We did record today's session, and that recording link will be provided to you in a follow-up email that you will receive tomorrow afternoon. Also in the follow-up email will be the survey link for you to request the CPE credit. On behalf of VinMinder, it has been a pleasure. Thank you all and have a great rest of your day.